Got off to a bit of a late start tonight. For me, still got the music up. Evening, Chris. Hey, where's the Benny? I hit play. Ah, there it is. Sorry about that. Oh, yeah. Song begins. I don't know why the begins at 8 p.m. thing, the date on the file is 2015. It's just one of those mysteries. Hey, everybody. In the urban room of the Congress Hotel in Chicago. And first of all, hey, Gabriel, that's a shame. Blue skies. Hey, Deanna. Hey, John. Hey, Mom. Hey, Ann. Hey, Gladys. Jim. Evening, Evelyn. Hey, Dad. Hey, April and Dawn. Might warning you to be here. I was just thinking if I had a boat tour tonight. 401 North Wabash. It's a hotel, but so few people go here, you could really store nuclear documents here pretty safely. Because who would see them? Hey, Donna. I've been watching the Field of Dream games earlier. Hey, Josh, how you doing, man? I'm out of bourbon. Well, not out, just out of this bottle. Hey, Octavio. Yeah, I was watching the Field of Dream game until it was time to come here. Here's me and my siblings at the Field of Dreams 30-some years ago. Hey, Bob. Yeah, thanks, Kim. I don't want to make it look like I'm a true crime guy here, so. Evening, Gary. Evening all around. Thanks, Early. Ellen, very sorry. History Channel got moved again. Evening, Lori. Where are the cats? Good question. They're around here someplace. Our little usual special guest. Miles has got to show up.
Benny Goodman presents Helen Ward singing With All My Heart.
Hey, Eileen. Yeah, this is a letter Al Capone wrote to his wife from prison. It's a poem. Small dog, not really. I've seen those Morkies at by the stone wall. Lori, it's not supposed to be all theirs. They've just kind of claimed it. You notice I got some tape on it on the side right now. I'm trying to teach him not to scratch it. Hey, Deloria in Alabama. Welcome, Rosemary. Always glad to have some first-time attendees here. Telling all the miracles. Oh, speak of the devil. Look who's here. This is Miles, for those of you who are new. Miles is under contract. He has to be a special guest on every episode. He's now fulfilled his contract, but he might stick around and show up again at the end when we're hanging out with a larger window.
Benny Goodman goes way back and gets a lot of rhythm out of Walk, Jenny, Walk. Benny Goodman and his orchestra.
He knows the sound of this music. Carol, that's probably something in your settings. Something in my back pocket. Oh. The Pizza Mania punch card. I wonder how we combine it with the other ones. It has been a bit since I played Earl Father Hines. Seems like it wasn't that long ago. But people recognize the Benny. Ah. Okay, Miles. Hey, DD. We'll do our best to help you stay awake. No big sound effects or anything. Hey, welcome, Denise. Hey, Cindy. I've been making sure we got a lot of new people. That often means a lot of tech support questions coming in. Sometimes with accusations of being a scammer if they couldn't get it running. We'll let Benny Goodman do one more tune.
In the same vein, Rosetta.
My alls. Yeah. Hey, Chuck. Timothy, I'm always jealous of people who find the Sick Fisher art drops. Those of you not familiar, like Sick Fisher art drops, I know all those words, but Sick Fisher is a muralist who does a lot of work around Chicago. Every Monday we do Mural Monday here. Sick Fisher is one of our favorites. Hey, David. Hey, Jordana. Yes, everybody. The questions. I see the comments about 20 seconds after they're posted, and while I'm actually running the tour, I probably won't see them at all. I might catch a stray one now and then. I like Skywalker. Kathleen, that's one of my favorites. That's one that we've actually done twice. I like it so much. On the Skokie Theater wall. Looks like you're inside a Nintendo game. Alright, I got a purring cat taking up all the space right here. I'll just let him stay here. It's okay. You can stick around here, Miles. Alright, that's Benny Goodman live at the Joseph Urban Room of the Congress Hotel in downtown Chicago back in 1935. Now that song is out of the way, it's time for us to get started properly. So welcome along, everybody. I'm Adam Seltzer for Mysterious Chicago Tours. I've been a tour guide and historian here in Chicago for going on 20 years. I've got about a dozen Chicago history books out, including Mysterious Chicago, the book, H.H. Holmes, The True History of the White City Devil, the new Murder Maps USA from Thames and Hudson, and just out this week officially, Graceland Cemetery, Chicago's Stories, Symbols, and Secrets. Finally released through University of Illinois Press. The review in New City mentioned that I've been teasing this book the entire time I've been doing virtual tours since back in about March of 2020. Why would a person start doing virtual tours in March of 2020? Future generations will have to solve that mystery, I suppose. But all right, today, well, one of the things when I started doing virtual tours is I figured out that in a virtual tour, we're not bound by geography. I could put together tours that we could never do in real life because they'd be spread too far around or places that we couldn't really get a bus in anyway. So, true crime in Chicago cemeteries. I've done true crime tours at Graceland. I've also I tried one at Rose Hill one time, but it's a little too spread out. But in this case, what we're going to do is true crime in Chicago cemeteries that covers cemeteries from all over the Chicagoland area, stuff that we'd never normally do. For instance, right up here in Rogers Park West Ridge area, is this shot of St. Henry's graveyard. Now, if you want to get technical, this is the only graveyard in Chicago. That's if you go by the really strict definition that a graveyard is a cemetery attached to a church. If it's not attached to a church, it's a cemetery, not a graveyard. Frankly, that's the kind of pedantic nonsense up with which I shall not put. But if you go by that definition, this one at St. Henry's, up here on Devon Avenue, just a little bit west of Clark, is the only graveyard in Chicago. And there's a lot of great names in this one. Like walking around, I found Margaretha Sinner. What a name. Anton Kill. Well, really, there's a whole bunch of good kills over in here. Like, next to Anton is Margaretha Kill. There's a lot of Margarethas. And next to him is actually Mary Kill. I really hope it's... don't you just hope the middle initial is an F? We'll move over past Mary Kill. Over to this smaller marker for Henry Munoz, who was one of the early settlers around this area, back when this was mostly just kind of a wasteland separating Chicago from the fledgling town of Evanston. People would come down here because you could get liquor down here when you couldn't in Evanston. Really, in Rogers Park was as of the 1860s, when Henry Munoz was killed, 1886, was still technically a dry town as well. So there were just like on the edges of the boundaries, there were lots of illegal taverns and speakeasies. Back before Prohibition, we still had illegal taverns all over the place. One night, Henry Munoz was hanging out in one of them. And the next night, some people were walking along down the path and saw his body lying there dead. So they made haste over to his house, knocked on the door. His son came and they said, "Son, is your father home?" And he said, "No, he didn't come home last night. Maybe I can just go ask my uncle." And they said, "Oh, don't bother, he's dead." This is how they reported it in the papers anyway. They must have been the kind of awkward thing, and they knock on the door, and first thing they think to say is your father home? The logical thing after that would be to say, "I bet you $20 he's not." Well, eventually nearby the body, they found a handkerchief. He hadn't been carrying a lot of money to rob, for anybody to rob, but there was a handkerchief with some blood on it nearby, and another guy who was kind of a temporary worker passing through the area had completely disappeared. The general sense was that this guy had presumably killed him, but he was never found, so the mystery was not officially solved. And I think there's also a possibility that it's maybe just the guy was going through and saw the body lying there on the ground and thought, "Oh no, everybody's going to think that I did it." So he fled, leaving his handkerchief behind him. That kind of thing it's plausible. This whole area, you hear a lot of stories from this general era about people walking between Evanston and Chicago and just there being hordes of rampaging drunks wandering around in the space. Hard to know exactly how seriously to take some of it, but that was a kind of a cool one to find. It's not a cemetery that gets a lot of attention here. We're going to move over a little ways west of here, out to Bohemian National Cemetery. There's a fairly tricky to find one here for a young woman by the name of Wanda Stopa. Now, Wanda Stopa, back in the 1920s, was the youngest assistant state's attorney in Illinois history. Well, there's a conflicting accounts as to exactly what she did as an assistant state's attorney. It was kind of more like a paralegal by most accounts. But while working as a lawyer, she also got married to a guy who claimed to be a Russian count by the name of Ted Glasgow. So technically, she would be a countess, but even while married to him, she started having an affair with a guy named Mr. Smith, who introduced her to the bohemian life, taking her around to jazz clubs, introducing her to artists. She started going to New York to hang out in Greenwich Village with all of the artists and geniuses type, kind of lost interest in the legal profession and got really more and more interested in Mr. Smith. And there are all these letters to him. He never really took her very seriously, but he put her up in an apartment in New York, and she would write letters saying, "Just tell me how it needs to be. If I can only have you on Saturdays, I'm okay with that. If you can only get away occasionally, I'll accept whatever it is." She ended up being particularly unpleasant towards Mrs. Smith, because Mr. Smith, the advertising executive who was putting her up in New York, was in fact already married. So finally, one day, she got herself a bunch of arsenic-laced chocolates and went to Mr. and Mrs. Smith's house with a gun, intending to either poison or shoot Mrs. Smith. But in the confusion when she got there, she fired off a round and instead shot one of the gardeners. So she took off, disappeared, drove away. This became national news everywhere. There was a nationwide hunt to try to find her. They finally found in a hotel room in Michigan she had eaten the chocolates herself and died. Her funeral was a massive affair. It's really kind of amazing that there aren't more pictures of her, or that she isn't that much better remembered than she is. It's just a wild story full of twists and turns. There's a picture outside of her house at the funeral. But she was taken up here to Bohemian National Cemetery, only to be revived in the newspapers about once every 20 years or so. Now, elsewhere in Bohemian National, over on Pulaski, is the family plot. There's a lot of places where we find the family plot of serial killer victims, not the actual serial killer themselves. Now, this is the Thevrazel family. Now, early in the 20th century, the Thevrazel family started dropping like flies. They had just hired this guy by the name of Herman Billick. Now, this is a very late picture of Herman Billick. Now, he was a fortune teller by trade. They were having trouble. They ran a milk company. There was a people across the street running another milk company. Then family members started dropping like flies. Now, Emma Thevrazel, pictured here, told everybody that it was really Herman Billick the entire time. He'd been having an affair with the mother, wanted to get everybody out of the way, wanted to take over the milk business for himself. The star witness at his trial was little Jerry. Little Jerry Thevrazel, the son of the family, who said himself, I saw him give my mother this powder, I saw him making plans. But later, after Herman had been convicted and went to prison, and this is what we generally remember, people usually talk about him as one of our antique serial killers in Chicago, but shortly thereafter, Jerry took his confession back and said, I only said that because the cops made me say that. I didn't see anything like that. The cops said if I didn't say that, they'd pin the whole thing on me and I would be hanged. So this is all recounted in more detail in a book by Steve Shookus called Poison that goes through the entire case really, really well and makes a very convincing case. He was eventually pardoned, was Mr. Billick. They never really landed on an actual suspect, but he makes a very convincing case that it was probably Emma Thevrazel, a daughter of the family, who herself was trying to get all of the money and ended up living off on the west side. There were other people connected to her who died of arsenic poisoning, but the state did a really good job of covering this up. They had already decided we've got this appropriately foreign-seeming guy to pin it on. If we then turn around and say, no, it was Emma the entire time, we'll look like fools. Let's just not investigate these arsenic deaths very carefully. This is the kind of thing they were known to do, that kind of dirty trick of telling an 11-year-old kid they're going to hang him if he doesn't lie in court. That's exactly the kind of stuff they did over and over in the Chicago police. We'll take a quick one. We'll hop over to Graceland for a second here. This is Lavinia Lane, who once broke into a courtroom and started beating up Judge Higgins. These were two 70-year-olds getting in a fight, busted out 3 windows of the courtroom. She said that Mr. Higgins owed her money. Mr. Higgins let it spread into the press that Lavinia was in fact a witch who was having bodies removed from her mausoleum to have them boiled in her kitchen. But right next to it is the Carter Harrison family plot. Now, there are multiple Carters Harrison who were mayor of Chicago. This is Carter the First. He was really Carter the Third or Carter the Fourth. But they always called themselves junior and senior. It gets a little bit confusing sometimes. Now, he had been mayor a few times around the 1880s. When he was running again in 1893, the Chicago Journal put out this huge article, Thieves on the Run, thugs flocking to Chicago from every quarter. Carter Harrison's nomination, the primary cause. They put forth the proposition here that if Carter Harrison is elected mayor, every thief, murderer, con artist, etc. are all going to come to Chicago. Now, coincidentally, the Chicago Tribune this very same day ran their first article about H.H. Holmes. But the Journal managed not to start saying I told you so when Carter Harrison was assassinated at the end of 1893. In fact, they changed it. We only now realized how much he was bone of our bone, marrow of our marrow, and how much his spirit touched all of our lives. Pretending they hadn't been saying horrible things about him this entire time. But right towards the end of the World's Fair of 1893, he having won the mayoral election as predicted, there was a guy who had been bugging him out throughout the campaign by the name of Patrick Prendergast. Now, Prendergast believed that Harrison was going to make him corporation counsel, a job for which he was completely unqualified. At the time, one of the big issues was railroad tracks needed to be raised up. Because railroad tracks at the time usually went right over streets and they were killing people with alarming frequency. So a lot of people had the idea we should raise them up at the crossings so they will just go over and won't run people over anymore. These days, most of like the old metro tracks and stuff, which are the old like Union Pacific tracks, are mostly generally raised up. You have to go under underpasses to get to them, to get through them. Now, Patrick said that he had some way of doing this that would not cost the city any money. However, he could never remember what that was when asked. And when Carter Harrison failed to make him corporation counsel, he busted into his house with a pistol. Now, here's a shot of what his house looked like. And there's a bit of a tie-in to another Chicago crime story, too. Sometimes we do early murders of Chicago. We talk about a couple of hangings that took place in 1857 in the brief period when Chicago was doing public executions. When this place was being built, it was originally the H.H. Honoré House. And when it was being built, there was some kind of labor problems. They couldn't get the roof finished. So they had all these neighbors and friends come over saying, hey, if you come up on the roof, you'll have a great view of the hanging. is the two public hangings that took place in Chicago after 1840 were on Ashland Street, right between Polk and Taylor. So this actually would have given you a pretty good view if you wanted to watch something like that. Now, Prendergast himself ended up being hanged, and fairly unusually, he actually has a marked grave. This is up at Calvary Cemetery, just over the line into Evanston. Now, it's not a particularly auspicious marker, but it's a lot more than most people who were ever hanged get. Now, his cellmate has an interesting story as well. We were just talking about how the state pulled all kinds of dirty tricks to get 11-year-old kids to confess. Other side of Calvary Cemetery, there's a more unmarked plot for a guy who was a cellmate of Prendergast in the 1890s. And it was generally agreed that Prendergast was probably what we would now diagnose as schizophrenic. Even the physician said so. If he had assassinated anybody else, he probably would not have been executed. But since it was the mayor, it was kind of like they had to hang somebody, which was often the case when somebody got hanged. It wasn't necessarily because they were clearly guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. It's just that they had to hang somebody. After one murder, the police picked up a guy named Buff Higgins, who was buried in an unmarked grave right about here. Now, Buff Higgins was just what they called a police character in those days. He was always getting arrested for hitting somebody or small-time robberies. In this case, they picked him up for a murder. They couldn't find any other real suspects for the murder, so according to Judge Goggin, who later wrote about the case, they locked him in a cell for a few days without food or water. Then finally they came in and gave him an entire pint of whiskey to drink. And once he was now obnoxiously drunk, they put a piece of paper in front of him and said, well, here you go, Buff. Here's your alibi statement. Just sign this and we'll know that you had an alibi at the time of the murder. Now, he was entirely too drunk to be able to read this document, and also illiterate to begin with, so he definitely did not know what he was signing. He was really signing a confession statement. And on the basis of that confession alone, he was hanged. In these days, we know a little bit better that false confessions are not really uncommon. Honestly, they're not even that unusual. People will sign just about anything to get out of situations like this and just figure, well, I can take it back later. But in those days, they never believed that a false confession could be made under any circumstances. So on the basis of that, Buff Higgins was hanged. And at the time, there were a lot of shouts coming from the galleries in the prison, prisoners shouting, "Hang the governor instead." Now, by this time, the 1890s, executions were private. About the late 1850s, the state law in Illinois changed. You couldn't have public executions anymore. But occasionally, they let so many people into the jail that it almost made no difference. For instance, elsewhere in Calvary, not too far from Buff Higgins, is the unmarked grave of at least one of the trunk murderers of 1885. A guy by the name of Giovanni Asari. And this was the thing, in 1885, there was a murder over in the Little Italy neighborhood, one of the Little Italy neighborhoods that we had at the time. A guy had been murdered, shoved into a trunk, and mailed to Pittsburgh. Mailing dead bodies happens remarkably commonly in stories like this. Now, the story was that Asari and two of his friends had found this guy, invited him up for a shave and a haircut, and then instead slit his throat and taken all of his money. He was defended in court by Kate Kane Rossi, the only woman lawyer at the time in Illinois. You notice the headline here. Later on, she was particularly known for attacking police officers in court. Some of the things that she said in court do not bear repeating. I can't really think of her as a hero, but she was certainly a pioneer in her field and was the only person who would defend somebody like Asari and his friends. But it was eventually they were all hanged. There was also a book about this one fairly recently. Elizabeth Dale wrote a book called The Chicago Trunk Murder, which makes a pretty convincing case that these guys, too, there was definitely reasonable doubt. They were just kind of picked because they were easy targets. They didn't speak English well enough that they could really defend themselves that well in court, and very quickly they'd already been tried in the court of public opinion. But the records here are a little bit odd, too. I could only find a record for Asari being buried here. I imagine the other two trunk murderers are around here someplace, too. And we've had some odd stories about police incompetence in early Chicago, and the stories of such are just legion. But one guy's so goofy you almost have to respect him for it was G.M. Shippy. Mr. Shippy was an inspector with the police along the time that Johann Hawk was arrested. We'll talk about Johann Hawk a bit more. He was the Chicago Bluebeard. One of his victims is buried in a space not too far from here that Mr. Shippy not only helped exhume, but now would actually be looking right at. Hawk would marry women, take their money, and run. About a third of the time, he would kill them as well. That is Shippy clear over on the right. No, he's on the left. That's him on the left. All these guys with mustaches. I think that's Hoffman on the right. But there was a particular case with Mr. Shippy when he became chief of police that a dead body washed up onto the shore, and Shippy tried to rent a horse that he thought could magically take him to the murderer. They had a bunch of usual suspects set up. Shippy was always coming up with weird things like that, like maybe the horse will be magic. At this point, he went out to Mount Carmel Cemetery where the victim had been buried and had the body exhumed and set up right in the morgue, set up on a chair looking like he was pointing. Now, whether he even could have pulled this off is very difficult to know, but it was reported in a number of cases at the time. A number of papers reported that he brought in suspect after suspect to face the dead bodies pointing at them, hoping it would scare somebody into confessing. Scared the hell out of a couple of them, but nobody was scared into confessing. Now, later on, there's a house that survived the Great Chicago Fire on the right, and just a couple doors down, Mr. Shippy's house is still standing. He'd been chief of police for a while. There's how it looked at the time, about 110 years ago. And you can see it's the same house here. They've removed the canopy out front. But other than that, the house and the one next to it are both the same. But there is this little plaque you can see right next to the railing there. We'll zoom in on the plaque here. The plaque says, "In memory of Lazarus Averbach, who emigrated from Russia in 1908 and died here shortly thereafter." Lazarus Averbach was a kid who moved here from Russia, just like it says. Late one night, he knocked on Shippy's door. Exactly what he was doing there, we never really found out. Shippy just thought that he looked like he might be an anarchist or a radical, which in those days was short for saying he looked like he was Jewish, and shot him to death. Now, eventually it was ruled that this was self-defense. They decided that Averbach must have been there to assassinate him. Really, there's not really one way or another to tell, but Clarence Darrow always thought it was an attempted assassination. That goes a long way with me. But in any case, we really just don't know for sure. And Shippy at the time was mentally deteriorating. It was his last day in uniform, and he spent the next few years in an asylum. Averbach is actually buried not far from Bohemian National, off Pulaski, at Ridgeland Cemetery. These old disused tombstones back here. The one that's still standing is Jerome Lazarus Averbach. And I'm just trying to sound out the Hebrew. Where does it? Oh yeah, the last line of Hebrew that says Averbach. I was trying to figure out how you would spell that exactly. Auerbach. While we're on the subject of police chiefs, we'll go over to Rose Hill for a second. This is Cumming Cherry on the right, a geologist. And across from him is the Badenoch family plot, which I stumbled onto by accident, but I was so excited to find this. I always seem to find people connected with this case by accident. This is John J. Badenoch. I was like, John J. Badenoch, you old so-and-so, I've sure been researching you a lot lately. He was the chief of police at the time that they investigated the H.H. Holmes murder castle building in Chicago. Now, this was 1895. The story was that Holmes had been operating a building where he had lured numerous women to be tortured and killed. Now, part of the reason we think that now is that Chief Badenoch had been on his job for 3 months. He was a flour and feed dealer by trade. He got the job of chief of police because the new mayor liked the cut of his jib. He had no qualifications for this whatsoever, and digging around the Holmes building, and they just thought, wow, we've solved every murder of the last 10 years. Their imaginations kind of ran away with them. The chief detective on that case was Detective Fitzpatrick, another guy I stumbled on. Just randomly thought I'd look up and see maybe that's the Fitzpatrick that was the Inspector Fitzpatrick. Which, by sheer coincidence, there's a lot of Fitzpatricks at any given Catholic cemetery in Chicago. But this was Detective Fitzpatrick, who Holmes himself allegedly said was making a fool of himself in the investigation. But he was one of the ones leading the charge as they came up with, finding things like, we found a rope, maybe he was hanging people. Some of their wild stories were their own. This is the diagram that was in the New York World, with a diagram of the building with rooms like the Room of the Three Corpses, the Black Closet, the Maze. Some of this the New York World kind of thought up on their own, but others really did come from the detectives just spitballing, really, speculating about what could have been done in the place. And most of it was stuff that could have been done in any of your homes. It's kind of a sobering thing to think of. You could make a murder castle from the things you find at home. But perhaps the most notable detective on the ground, we'll pretend that's a detective's shadow right there, not mine. You know, there's just one more thing. This is out at All Saints Cemetery in Niles. It's a small marker for Detective John W. Norton, who had been with the force for a couple of years. He was a detective sergeant when he was working on the Holmes investigation, and ended up being involved with the police for over 30 more years. Really, all through the early 20th century, there's hardly a major true crime case in Chicago where Detective John Norton doesn't show up. For instance, I know we got some new people, so I'll go ahead and tell this one. I tell this one on so many tours, it's just such a story. Here we are at Graceland. And this is a space, I think I didn't have time to add this one into the book, the Graceland book. But this is Ruth Anna Wanderer. Ruth Wanderer was married to this guy by the name of Carl Wanderer. And one day she became pregnant. A few months later, she was walking home from the movies with Carl, and a drifter jumped down from behind the vestibule of their house. And the drifter said, all right, give me all your money. Wanderer pulled out a gun and shot the drifter to death, then turned to the side and shot his wife to death too, poor Ruth. His plan was, we don't exactly know why he had planned this, but he had set the whole thing up with the drifter. He was supposed to punch him and look like a hero, but instead shot him to death and then blamed him for the death of his wife as well. Carl Wanderer has got to be the best name ever for a ghost. Now, initially, the newspapers were all saying, oh, this poor man, Mr. Wanderer, who lost his wife while heroically trying to save her life. But Detective Norton, who looked like this at the time, wasn't quite buying it. He was the one who asked all the questions and said, now, there's just one more thing I don't understand. So, you've got this gun and he's got this gun, but they're the same model of gun and they're one serial number off? How did that happen? And Carl just said, oh, well, they were both my gun, but I had two of them and he took one of them away from me. Sure, Carl. He would go on to be a major player in a lot of these stories. He'll come up again later on. In fact, I think we might as well move ahead on to the gangsters, most of whom are at Mount Carmel. But first of all, we will stop in at Oakwood Cemetery, where as part of Mystericon on October 2nd, we will be doing a cleanup of the Jewish sections here. Our annual cleanup. There's the south end of the section, there's a bunch of Jewish sections that aren't really maintained. They're not owned by Dignity Memorial, who owns the rest of the cemetery. And the synagogues have all long since moved away. But up here in the main body of the cemetery is the mausoleum of Big Jim Colosimo, one of several Big Jims who were operating in Chicago around the early 20th century. He was the vice lord of the city for a while. But then Prohibition started up, and he told everybody, I don't think we should get involved. For one thing, it's going to be the feds, not the local police. They're much harder to bribe. And second of all, I just married a chorus girl. She wants me to straighten up and fly right. So we'll still do the girls, we'll still do the gambling, all of that stuff, but no booze, not in Chicago. So here's how that turned out. He was shot to death in his cafe. The usual suspect among historians is Frankie Yale, who had been Capone's boss back in Brooklyn. It just seems weird to me that Frankie Yale would be brought in for this kind of dirty work at the time. But it does make sense that they would bring somebody in that they trusted from out of town. Capone and his boss, John Torrio, took over after this. But really, he was every gangster in town had a reason to want to kill him. So Detective Norton was brought in once again. He sat down with the widow and said, now let me ask, is there anybody that you suspect? And she said, well, really, I suspect everyone. Here's Bathhouse John and Hinky Dink Kenna, the first ward alderman at the time, paying tribute to him at his funeral. Bathhouse John sang Ave Maria. Bathhouse John was a goofball of an alderman who liked to sing. I think that may be the scariest thing about him. But while we're here, let's take a quick tomb snoop. Let's see what we got there. See, James Colosimo, 1870 to 1919, which is very bizarre because he died in 1920. And this is not in dispute. We've got all the newspapers, the death certificate, and everything. The 1610 glossy photographs with circles and arrows on the back, and a photo paragraph explaining what each one is. Typos in cemeteries are not uncommon. Incidentally, here is Bathhouse John, who appeared at his funeral. Bathhouse John and his partner Hinky Dink Kenna were the aldermen of the first ward back when we had 2 aldermen per ward. And in addition to getting murderers off the hook on the regular and being as crooked as they come, he was also known to write songs. Later on, newspaper reporters would claim that they were the ones who wrote the songs. I would not have taken credit for them personally. But songs like Ode to a Bathtub, Ode to a Bowl of Soup, Why'd They Make Lake Michigan So Wide, So Awful Wide. There's a particular banger called She Sleeps by the Side of the Drainage Canal. And here he is promoting Straw Hat Day. Towards the end of his life, everybody just thought of him as this amiable goofball and had him like promoting Straw Hat Day or a contest to find the first robin of spring. Now, Hinky Dink is also in this cemetery. It's a much smaller grave. But at the time, so John Torrio, after the death of Big Jim, just carved the city up into territory and said, okay, you take yours, we'll take ours. No reason that we need to kill each other. That actually worked for a little while there. Move in on Mike Merlot here a bit. Get a view here. But eventually, of course, they started double-crossing each other, moving into each other's territories, and Torrio certainly started wanting to kill Dino Banyan, the head of the North Side mob especially, but he didn't dare because Mike Merlot didn't want anybody killing each other. Mike Merlot was the head of the Union Siciliana. That was a civic organization officially, but was so powerful that even the mob didn't do anything that might make them mad. By the end of the 1920s, the head of the Union Siciliana was also really the head of the mob. It was really just kind of a front organization by then. Early on, he had been working, the earliest I find records of him is like 1920. He's working on petitions to get Sam Cardinello, Il Diavolo, freed. And on the petition for that, you see people like Frank Arnitto. That's Frank the Enforcer Nitty right there. Joe Aiello is on this page too, I think. But Torrio wanted O'Banion out of the way, but didn't dare do anything about it while Mike Merlot was alive. But then Mike Merlot died of natural causes. And this was a really big deal. The funeral was absolutely huge. This was we already had a massive funeral for people like Colosimo at the time. By then, the massive gangland funeral had become kind of a trope. Thousands of mourners, dozens of trucks worth of flowers. So Dino Banyan happened to be in the flower business himself on the side. I think he worked for a place called Schofield Flowers. He was partnered with Mr. Schofield. I imagine he probably worked at the location near Devon and Broadway more often. That was a lot closer to his house. But for the day of the Mike Merlot funeral, he went down to the State Street location. A few guys came in saying they were here to get flowers for Merlot, and then they ended up shooting him to death. A few different theories about who this might have been. Scalisi and Anselmi come up a lot. The Jenna brothers come up a lot. But O'Banion is not too far away from Mike Merlot himself. The full obelisk there. And there he is being taken out in a body bag. Individual marker right there. Elsewhere in the same cemetery are the Jenna brothers, sometimes said to be the guys who had done the deed of killing O'Banion. These were some guys on the west side who nominally worked for Capone, though they were always trying to move in and move up in the world. They had figured out that there was a loophole in the law. You could still manufacture rubbing alcohol. So all over Little Italy, they were paying people a fortune to operate stills for rubbing alcohol in their basement. But after the death of Dino Banyan, they were just knocked out one by one. This is Tony Jenna, who was shot on Grand Avenue, His brothers Angelo and Mike, who were killed in drive-bys, killed outside of their houses. There was an interesting line when when Mike Jenna was interred here. Genevieve Forbes Herrick of the Chicago Tribune was present at the interment. She was the Tribune's ace crime reporter at the time, and overheard a guy saying, "There's Mike and Dean and Jenna. When Judgment Day comes and them 3 graves are open, there'll be hell to pay in this cemetery." And they were only getting started. Jaime Weiss, one of the guys who took over for Dean O'Banion, is also here at Mount Carmel. There's a picture of him outside a Holy Name Cathedral where he was shot to death. Tour after tour tells people this little hole in the wall in the cornerstone there is from one of the bullets. It is not. The church really hates people telling that story. Well, one of the other guys who took over was Vinnie the Schemer Drucci. They called him Schemer because he was always coming up with wild schemes like, hey, why don't we go to London and steal the crown jewels? This is definitely a guy who would have stolen nuclear documents and hidden them in his basement until he could sell them to foreign adversaries. Real name, Vinnie D'Ambrosio. Looked about like this. Eventually was shot by the police during an election. They were rounding up all the suspicious characters. While they were going over the LaSalle Street Bridge, he reached for the cop's gun, so the cop shot him to death. Later on, many people doubted that he had really reached for the cop's gun, but everybody was so glad to be rid of Vinnie the Schemer Drucci that nobody seemed to really fight this one. And of course, the most famous resident of Mount Carmel Cemetery. Schemer knows scheming. If only that worked. So this is the whole Capone family plot. They were originally at Mount Olivet, but moved over to here. It's Alphonse. This is, you can read various interpretations of who this is a picture of Capone with. But that's Capone at about the age of 25. When I was first running ghost tours, we would go into a bar that had this picture, and I would stand there saying, so who do you suppose is older, me or Capone in this picture? And I was actually slightly older than him. I looked way younger back then. But this is Capone about the age of 30. This is Capone 10 years younger than I am now. And this was noted in the press at the time. There's one of them, Sissy Patterson interviewed him once, and she said, well, why don't you just go back to Italy? And he said, I'm no Italian. I was born in New York 31 years ago. And she said, you're 31? Because he looked easily 51. Elsewhere in the plot here is his brother Ralph Capone, who was hiding guns and booze all over his house. And when the place got raided, the guy doing the raiding was Detective Sergeant John W. Norton. He found, guns being used as curtain rods, secret passages all over the place, stuff hidden inside of radios. You gotta wonder if, while he was going through Ralph Capone's place, he ever had any flashbacks about poking through the H.H. Holmes building, now nearly 30 years before. They didn't mention the connection in the papers at the time. In 1924, nobody seemed to remember H.H. Holmes anymore. But all of the gangsters shooting each other really came to a head. It didn't come to an end, but it came to a head in 1929 at the SMC Cartage Company with the St. Valentine's Day Massacre, in which 5 gangsters and 2 hangers-on from the Bugs Moran gang were lined up against the wall by guys dressed up like cops, who were really presumably working for Capone, and shot down. One of these guys is buried right over here at Rose Hill Cemetery. One of the guys who was just kind of a hanger-on. He said that he was an eye doctor by trade, not really a gangster. Frankly, I don't believe it. No, the drinking game, you only drink when I say H.H. Holmes if it's out of context. It's justified by the presentation here. Well, that's Reinhard Schwimmer. Now, among the other people there was a guy, Frank Gusenberg, who insisted nobody shot nobody. Nobody got shot here. Same newspapers quoted Reinhard Schwimmer's mother. This is our source on him not being a gangster. His mother said he was always a good boy. Let's move just to the side a little ways from Mr. Schwimmer. I think I've sped this one up because it's a bit of a walk. You see the guy going backwards. Out of context, H.H. Holmes only, otherwise you guys are all going to be too sloppy drunk. Just over to the side in Rose Hill is an unassuming-looking marker for Katherine Evans, who witnessed one of the most notable instances of true crime in American history. Died here in 1926, but that was after a lifetime working in the theater. When she was only 19 or barely 20 years old, she was operating in Washington, D.C., and had the first line on stage the night that Abraham Lincoln was assassinated at Ford's Theater. She then spent days trying to find black crepe because she was under suspicion. All of the actors were under suspicion at the time. She really wanted to make sure that she looked like she was mourning sufficiently. Which she was. She was thought it was a horrible tragedy, was just horrified to think that her husband had just been drinking with John Wilkes Booth. But all of the theater people were under suspicion at the time. Nobody knew how they let him in. Nobody knew who might have been planning at the time. So it was very important to her that she get as much black crepe as humanly possible. We have a number of little connections to the Lincoln assassination in Chicago cemeteries. Back over at Graceland, it's a guy by the name of John Wilson. It's sometimes not remembered that Lincoln wasn't the only target that night. Other people were planning to kill Secretary of State Seward and Vice President Johnson. And Seward was very nearly killed as well. The guy busted into his house with a knife, stabbed him up really good. John Wilson here was one of the doctors who attended to him and ended up in possession of the knife. I don't know whatever became of the knife. I don't want to say it might be buried right here, because it's probably not buried right here. It's probably not buried right here. That never happens in real life. I'll move up over here. John Kinsey executed was the first murderer in Chicago. He killed a rival named John Lalim. Officially, it was self-defense, but there was a lot of doubters. There's some letters that only came to light relatively recently that make it pretty clear it was a straight-up assassination. But across from him is this field. Back behind Eternal Silence, the statue by Laredo Taft at the Graves family plot. Now, there are a number of true crime stories back here in the field. This is mostly used up space. It's not all empty. It's mostly just unmarked. But one of the ones that does have a marker is a guy named George Hutchinson, who ended up associated with the Lincoln assassination as well. He was one of the witnesses who was later arrested for perjury. And elsewhere, this is the courthouse where Lincoln's funeral was held. Now, this is also where they used to hang people for a while, after they stopped doing them in public before this place burned down. One of the people hanged here who ended up in Graceland Cemetery is a guy by the name of George Driver. George Driver is buried out in this section someplace. He was such a horrible drunk that his wife kicked him out, but then she let him back in when he tried to quit drinking, even though they had gotten divorced by then. And then one night he killed her. He was eventually hanged, and on this platform he said, I warn everybody to stay away from whiskey. You know, good advice. We're going a little over time here. So I'll just cover kind of briefly. This is the Haymarket Monument out at Forest Home Cemetery. It is a monument to the Haymarket guys. This was a thing in 1885. There was a rally for the 8-hour workday, and in defense of a couple of striking workers who had been killed. So the second the permit for this rally expired, the cops started marching towards it, pointing guns at everybody. While they did, a gun went off, and they never figured out who threw the bomb. Sorry, not a gun. A bomb went off. The cops started firing into the crowd. They never figured out who threw the bomb, but all of the speakers were arrested, and 5 of them, some of whom weren't even present at the time, were eventually sentenced to be executed. So they're all buried over here at Forest Home Cemetery. And nearby is one of their wives, Lucy Parsons, who remained an active force in the anarchy movement for about 50 years. She was still making speeches in Chicago as late as the late 1930s. Interesting person herself. It's been speculated that she might have been born enslaved, though she denied that herself. Her background is a real mystery. I think the other common thing is she may have been Cherokee. But I don't have any good crime reports on her, so we'll just move on to elsewhere in the cemetery is an unmarked space for a woman by the name of Belle Gunness. Now, Belle Gunness may be the most prolific serial killer that I talk about. We don't really know. She started out working in Chicago, then eventually got herself a farm in Indiana, in LaPorte, Indiana. One night the farm burned down shortly after she had taken out a lot of money out of her account in the bank. Then when they started digging up, they couldn't find her at first, but they found body after body buried on the farm. Apparently, she had been luring wealthy men to the farm, somehow acquiring their money and then killing them. Since they couldn't find her body at first, it was suspected that she must have faked her death and probably set up the fire herself. So newspapers were like doing composite shots of what she might look like in disguise, what she might look like as a man in an overcoat. Eventually, they found some bridge work, some false teeth that were said to have been hers, and decided that it must have really been her. But even now, nobody really seems to know who set the fire, whether she did it herself, whether it might have been an accident, whether it might have been a disgruntled employee or a disgruntled apprentice who thought detectives were getting too close. We really don't know. A couple of weeks ago for Find a Grave Friday, we found the graves of a couple of detectives who were later said to have been involved in the case, which might be a clue. We haven't quite figured it out yet. But here's how Belle looked after about 100 years when she was exhumed, so that they could find out if it was actually her or not. The results were inconclusive. All right, I got a few more in here, but we're over time for tonight. So I'm going to go ahead and start plugging the upcoming tours. Pretty soon there's going to be like a volume 1 and a volume 2 of this, except that nobody ever comes to volume 2s of things. So, coming up, our next virtual tour will be H.H. Holmes' The True History. That'll be on August 18th, a week from today. Well, also, Sunday morning, one of the Graceland tours is going to be live streamed right at our usual time, Sunday at 10. It'll probably start a little bit earlier, really. So, H.H. Holmes has been in the news quite a bit lately. They've started announcing casting for the Devil in the White City TV series that'll be on Hulu. So H.H. Holmes, The True History. I figured I should probably run that one again. And also the following Sunday, there will be a walking tour for him. Now, it's almost the end of summer, so we're almost out of time to do our time travel pub crawl Endless Summer, the Tiki Tour. That'll be coming up in a couple of weeks. In-person ones that are currently on sale are August 21st and 27th at Graceland Cemetery, and August 21st in the evening, H.H. Holmes, The Devil Downtown. Of course, September 30th and October 1st and 2nd are Mystericon. You got to get your tickets now. The boat tour tickets are going fast. We're going to be running 2 boat tours on that first night, 6:30 and 8:30. And we've started rolling out some of the other tours as well that'll be coming up over the course of that weekend. It's a whole weekend of great tours and great hangs. Now, if you're new around here, there is a Facebook group called Mysterious Chicago Miles Fan Club and Mysterious Chicago Regulars. And you go there, that'll give you all the details about the upcoming Mystericon. Now, should you need a Mysterious Chicago sweatshirt, t-shirt, hoodie, etc., go to cafepress.com/MysteriousChicago. You can get all kinds of stuff there, including the There's Only One Way to Hawk t-shirts, or the slightly naughtier, Rock Out with Your Hawk Out. So lots of great stuff coming up here, everybody. Thanks to everybody who is tuned in. Thanks to everybody who is contributing, and especially those of you who are joining the Patreon, which is your best bang for your buck. So I'm Adam from Mysterious Chicago. We'll put the money back on and hang out while I drink some more of this whiskey. Sorry, George Driver. Thanks, Andrea. Thanks, Marcia. Good night, Laura. Yeah, thanks, Natalie. Now, those of you new here, I always stick around to answer questions, but at the time we end up just talking about food. Gene, I have no idea. No way to tell. Thanks, Peter, over on YouTube. We do talk about pie a lot, too. And Denise, it's always the same time. On Thursdays, it's always 8 p.m. Central, 9 Eastern. Lori, no Iowa State Fair trip for me this year. I did see the picture out of the Wisconsin State Fair of the gummy-infused bratwurst. It looks terrible. I have to try it. Gary, yes, Lazarus is buried there. Loaded with missing gangsters. Wolf Lake was a popular place to dump bodies for sure. I'm not sure there's any of them still there at this point. Well, Laura, we're glad to have you. Where did Miles go? Yeah, Miles is over here on the chair. We'll just bring the camera to Miles here. There you go, Miles. Say hi, everybody.
That was the beautiful rag, Benny Goodman's own arrangement. Now, the popular tune, Thanks a Million.
It's the new chair. The cats both love it. Sometimes I get to sit on it, too. Yeah, Amy, you need to shut up, Malort, but it's Wisconsin. Malort's a Chicago thing. It's ours. And we were Old Milwaukee. It's our great beer, and they can't have it. Or there was a commercial that they used to play on the Cubs radio shows, the Cubs on the radio all the time, like interrogating a couple of guys that they found with Old Milwaukee. Is like, so, you guys from around here? Like, oh, yeah, man. We're farmers. Like, what kind of farm you guys have? The kind with a bunch of cows. You mean a herd of cows? Yeah, we herd of cows. We're farmers. All right, guys, give over the beer. Old Milwaukee is our great beer, and they can't have it. Weird that I can still remember commercials from 30 years ago. But I guess that's the point of them. They're supposed to be memorable. Oh, am I frozen? Oh, there it goes. Beth, you probably can get that chair, but in blue. It comes in a lot of different colors. You know, Lori, I don't know to this day if I've ever actually had an Old Milwaukee. Yes, Wisconsin can keep their gasoline and their contaminated thing across from the Mars Cheese Castle. But speaking of Wisconsin, we'll be there in the morning. Every Friday morning is Find a Grave Friday at the morning mini tour at 10 o'clock Central. That's where I go to a cemetery where I know somebody is buried, but I don't find out quite where or what the gravestone looks like. We figure it out in the comments, and then we play hot and cold until I find it. Tomorrow we're going to be in Milwaukee for that. I don't know exactly which cemetery or which grave yet, but Mandy Crypt and I are going to go do Find a Grave Friday. We've done Find a Grave in several different states now. We've done it in New York, D.C., Iowa, Indiana, Ohio. All over the place. Georgia. We did it in Georgia, right? Yeah, we did it in Georgia. Laura, good night. Thanks for coming out. I got the occasional tech support thing while I'm on here. Sarah, yeah, that's what you guys are just moving it all around on me. Last week we found a Medal of Honor recipient from World War I. Week before that we found the detectives who supposedly were looking into Belle Gunness at the time of her death. And if she thought a detective was after her, that would be a clue as to why the place burned down. But not necessarily a good clue, because it could be that Ray Lamphere, the janitor, or the accomplice, found out that there were detectives and freaked out. It could be that Belle freaked out. Who knows? Yeah, I need to get to a state fair. I haven't been to a state fair in a few years now. I've been to the Iowa one and the Wisconsin one and the Ohio one. Iowa's the best. There's no comparison. You know, one year at the Iowa State Fair, I ate a deep-fried butter on a stick, then watched Kiss play from the back row of the grandstand. I've never felt so American in my life. Debbie, what's this community standards question? I don't know about that. The Illinois State Fair started in the last day or two. I saw the clip of Mr. T saying, "I pity the fool who don't vote for J.B. Pritzker." I pity that fool too. Well, Debbie, that's weird. I'm always concerned some troll's gonna come after us for one of my Trump jokes or something. But I do hear the Texas State Fair is a big deal. It's Texas, it ought to be. But I guess the Iowa State Fair no longer has the Barclays cookies. They got muscled out. That's a crying shame. Yeah, whiskey and a cookie should be fun. And the first thing that occurred to me tonight, there's a Bob Dylan song called Julius and Ethel. It's an outtakes from the Infidels record all about Julius and Ethel Rosenberg, who were executed for supposedly selling off secrets of the atomic bomb. You know, Donald and Melania as a parody just about writes itself. There's a line in the Dylan one about Senator Joe was king that kind of still works. Yeah, Jerry, I wouldn't start an Arizona State Fair this early either. Like, let it cool down a little. Maybe that's probably fair. We have certain standards, I suppose. Decency and propriety, but we have different ideas of what might be decent and proprietous than others. Like to paraphrase Tom Lehrer, everybody has a cause these days, and mine is swearing. I'm for it. Eeny, meeny, miny, mo. It's a saying high and low. Hear it everywhere you go, any time of day. Well, Dana, you know what I watched last night is Don't Tell Mom the Babysitter's Dead. I had never seen that before. But whoever did the art direction did a great job of making it look like a regular 1991 house. It's fun to watch just because, you know, they've got old Trix boxes in that see-through phone that everybody had at the time. And I thought it was like a wild party movie. It's really not. It's really a Christina Applegate vehicle that resembles a Horatio Alger story more than anything else. But I rather enjoyed it. More than I thought I would anyway. And the dishes are done, man. Somebody else in my comments said they still say, I'm right on top of that, Rose, all the time. I feel like it needed one more edit to the script. And also probably some executives not trying to turn it into a teenage Home Alone. That's the impression I got is it started out as a Christina Applegate vehicle that would have been a pretty good one. But then they decided to give it a title like Don't Tell Mom the Babysitter's Dead and try to make it into like, kind of look like half of a party movie. Then it also reminded me of movies like Big, etc., where a teenager or somebody way too young is given a job way beyond their capabilities and turns out to save the company. Debbie duly noted. See what else have I watched lately that was good? I've been watching Pride of the Yankees off and on. They make no effort whatsoever to make Gary Cooper look like he's actually college age. He's clearly in his 40s the whole time. Beth, cheers to you. After the clip of Beto calling somebody a motherfucker last night, Dee Snider of Twisted Sister said he'd be happy to go back on stage, which he's technically retired from, and saying we're not going to take it for the Beto campaign. And he has now confirmed on Twitter that they have contacted him. Well, let's see if any of this mail. All right, looks like none of the mail tonight. Office of the Illinois State Treasurer. Do we have money for you? Well, that'd be nice, but I'm guessing no. Probably the other way around. You know, Dana, I saw Dee just about 4 or 5 years ago playing a solo show at Riot Fest. And it's like, wow, no, this guy is a professional. He covered Head Like a Hole by 9 Inch Nails, and it was just perfect. Because that song really is a Twisted Sister song. But unfortunately, his new single came out right at the same time as the video came out about the millennial whoop. The tendency to have this phrase, oh, in songs, which is not necessarily a millennial thing, has been going on forever. But his new single included the millennial whoop, and everybody around me noticed it. Carrie, they played the Come Out and Play album? I thought they just kind of ignored that one. In favor of Stay Hungry. I think most of their set list was usually Stay Hungry tracks, wasn't it? That is often my vocal warm-up before long boat tours or something. Is singing Stay Hungry. Are you feeling the fire? Opened my voice right up. All right, well, that's Benny Goodman wrapping up, so I suppose it's time for me to wrap up as well. Upcoming events, once again, Sunday morning will be at Graceland Cemetery. The 2 is sold out, but we will be live streaming it for free with suggested donations. Next virtual tour is August 18th, a week from today. H.H. Holmes, The True History. And a week after that, it'll be a time travel pub crawl. Now, in-person tours, August 21st and 27th, there are still some tickets for Graceland Cemetery. And August 21st, it's H.H. Holmes, The Devil Downtown. We still got some tickets for the boat tours as well, coming up at the end of September. All right, Carrie, that makes more sense if it was Stay Hungry. According to Dee's book, Leader of the Pack is never mentioned among the band. So, all right, everybody, thanks a lot for joining me. I'm Adam for Mysterious Chicago Tours. I'll see you in the morning in Wisconsin for some brandy old fashions and a Find a Grave Friday. It'll be a little early for brandy old fashions. But all right, thanks a lot, everybody. I'm Adam for Mysterious Chicago Tours, saying to stay safe and stay strong. And, of course, if you can, ladies and gentlemen, you got to stay spooky.